You walk through the front door of a house in 1974. The first thing you notice is the carpet. It's thick and it's plush and it's the color of a ripe avocado, and it seems to rise up around your shoes like a soft, green meadow. The walls are covered in a bold, geometric wallpaper in shades of burnt orange and mustard yellow, and hanging above the sofa is an enormous macramé owl, watching you with button eyes, presiding over the room like a feathered deity. In the corner, a massive wooden console television hums quietly to itself, waiting for the evening news. And somewhere, faintly, you can hear the warbling keys of a home organ drifting in from the living room, because yes, someone in this house plays the organ. This is the American home of the 1970s, and today we are going back inside. Welcome to a time when home decor was anything but subtle, when color was a philosophy, texture was a statement, and the word cozy somehow meant both wrapped in handmade yarn and sunk 3 steps below the rest of the floor. If you grew up in America during this decade, or if you visited a grandparent or an aunt who did, you already know exactly what we're talking about. And if you didn't, well, buckle up, because what American homeowners were doing to their interiors in the 70s was unlike anything that came before or after. To understand why the 70s looked the way it did, you have to understand what it was reacting against. The 50s and 60s had given Americans the dream of the cookie-cutter suburb. Row after row of nearly identical ranch homes with nearly identical carpets and nearly identical living rooms, and for a generation that had survived the Depression and the war, that sameness was actually comforting. It meant stability. It meant you had made it. But by the early 70s, a younger generation of homeowners had grown up inside that sameness, and they were done with it. They wanted something more expressive, more individual, more alive. And if the result occasionally made your eyes water, well, that was a small price to pay for self-expression. So let's start on the floor, because in the 70s, the floor was where the decade announced itself most loudly. Shag carpet had been around in some form since the 60s, but it was really the 70s that took it mainstream in a big way, and the reason was simple economics. Advances in synthetic fiber manufacturing made it suddenly affordable for middle-class American families to carpet their entire home in something that felt genuinely luxurious underfoot. And shag wasn't just carpet. It was an experience. The fibers were long, sometimes astonishingly long, standing up in thick tufts that swallowed your feet up to the ankle. Running your hand across it in one direction left a dark streak. Running it back the other way erased it. Children spent hours doing exactly this. The colors, of course, were part of the whole package. Avocado green was everywhere. Not a subtle, muted sage green, but a deep, assertive, fully committed to being a vegetable kind of green. Burnt orange was perhaps even more ubiquitous, a color that somehow managed to feel simultaneously warm and alarming. Mustard yellow completed the trio, and together these 3 shades formed the official-unofficial color palette of the American 70s interior. They showed up on carpets, on walls, on appliances, on bath towels, and yes, as we will get to shortly, on toilet paper. The shag carpet also had its famous downsides, and no 70s carpet retrospective would be complete without acknowledging them. The pile was so thick and so dense that things disappeared inside it. Hairpins, earring backs, small coins, the occasional bottle cap, all of them swallowed whole, lost in the fibers until the room was vacuumed or rearranged. And vacuuming was itself a project, because a standard upright vacuum couldn't get the job done. What the shag carpet required was a dedicated shag rake, a wide, comb-like tool designed specifically to separate and fluff the fibers back to their original upright glory. These rakes hung in closets across America, a strange and utilitarian piece of equipment that every household had and nobody ever talked about at parties. But if the floor was doing its part, the walls were not about to be outdone. Wallpaper had been a feature of the American home for generations, but in the 70s it reached what you might call its maximum expression. Homeowners were no longer content with a tasteful stripe or a delicate floral border. The new wallpaper was loud. It was bold. It was enormous. Geometric prints with interlocking shapes that seemed to pulse if you looked at them too long. Giant botanical prints featuring overscale ferns and tropical leaves. Abstract swirls and op-art patterns that would have felt at home in a museum of modern art. And the dominant palette, naturally, stuck close to home, earth tones, warm shades, the mustard and orange and brown spectrum that seemed to permeate every design decision of the decade. What made the 70s wallpaper situation particularly dramatic was that it rarely stopped at the walls. Adventurous homeowners took their patterns up over the ceiling as well, creating a fully enveloping, room-sized cocoon of pattern. Dining rooms were a particular favorite for this treatment, and the effect, depending on your tolerance for bold visual statements, was either completely immersive or slightly dizzying. Sometimes both at once. Now let's talk about the living room in more detail, because the 70s living room was not just a room. It was a stage set, carefully assembled from a very specific cast of furniture and electronics that no serious household of the era would have been caught without. The centerpiece of most living rooms was the television, and in the 70s, the television had finally grown up. Color TV had arrived in force, and American families were upgrading from their old black and white sets in enormous numbers. But the televisions of the 70s were not the sleek, flat panels we're used to today. They were furniture. Substantial pieces of wooden cabinetry, built on legs, occupying real square footage in the room. A 21-inch color console television was a major household purchase, costing around $500 in the money of the time, which translates to something close to $3,500 in today's terms. You did not buy one of these lightly. And when you brought it home, you positioned it with care, because this was not an appliance. This was a statement piece. Right alongside it, or sometimes built into a matching cabinet system, was the stereo console. These were equally substantial, equally wooden, and equally proud of themselves. Inside the handsome exterior, behind a panel of threaded fabric that muffled the speakers, lived an entire entertainment ecosystem: a turntable for vinyl records, a receiver for the radio, and critically, an 8-track player. The 8-track cartridge was the dominant home music format of the mid to late 70s, a chunky plastic brick that slid into a slot in the console and played your favorite albums on a continuous loop. The format had its quirks. It occasionally shifted tracks in the middle of a song at the most inopportune moments, but Americans embraced it enthusiastically all the same, and those wooden console stereos became the physical heart of the 70s living room. And then there was the home organ. If you were of a certain age and a certain ambition in the 1970s, you might well have decided that what your living room really needed was a home organ. Brands like Lowrey set up shop in shopping malls all across America, and if you wandered past one of their demonstration areas on a Saturday afternoon, a cheerful salesperson would sit you down and show you how even a complete beginner could play recognizable music with just a few minutes of instruction. The organs were designed to be inviting and approachable, with color-coded keys and light-up displays, and they became a particular pride point for families who had one. The home organ sat in the corner of the living room like a small, electric stage, and on holidays or special occasions, it became the center of gravity for the whole gathering. Now, while we're talking about the living room, we have to talk about sitting, because the way Americans arranged their seating in the 70s was as deliberate and as philosophically considered as anything else in the room. The most extravagant expression of this was the conversation pit. If you've never encountered one in person, the conversation pit was exactly what it sounds like: a sunken area built directly into the floor of the living room, usually carpeted in the same plush shag as the rest of the room, with built-in or modular seating arranged around the perimeter of the depression. The idea was that by descending a few steps into the pit, you were entering a dedicated social space, physically separated from the rest of the room, intimate and enclosed in a way that encouraged the kind of long, unhurried conversation that modern life was increasingly making difficult. They looked spectacular in design magazines. In practice, they were occasionally somewhat hazardous. Guests unfamiliar with the home had a tendency to walk directly into the pit, missing the step down entirely, especially if they had arrived on the darker side of a dinner party. A skinned knee at a 70s social gathering was not out of the question. But for those who loved them, and there were many, the conversation pit was the ultimate expression of 70s domestic sophistication, and the people who had them showed them off with real pride. For those without the architectural ambition or the construction budget for a full pit, the sectional sofa offered a more accessible path to the same basic idea of modular, flexible seating. The sectional, which had pieces that could be arranged and rearranged to suit the room or the occasion, allowed homeowners to feel like designers in their own right, and the category of possible configurations was essentially infinite. You could create a long L shape, a facing conversation grouping, a full U, or something that defied geometric description entirely. The sectional made the living room feel like a space you could customize, and in the 70s, that feeling of personal control over your environment was exactly what people were after. Somewhere in that living room, possibly draped across the back of the sectional, possibly folded over the arm of the sofa sleeper in the guest corner, was a granny square afghan. This is perhaps the most emotionally resonant artifact of the decade, the handmade blanket crocheted in a grid of small, colorful squares that someone in the family, usually a grandmother or an aunt, had made with enormous patience and genuine love. They came in every color combination imaginable, and they were universally present. They were also, it must be said, slightly scratchy. The acrylic yarn of the era had a determined texture to it that fell somewhere between cozy and vaguely abrasive, but nobody mentioned this, because the blanket had been made by hand by someone who loved you, and that settled the matter entirely. From the living room, let's move down the hall to the bathroom, where the 70s really let itself go in directions that seemed entirely logical at the time and seemed considerably more puzzling from a distance of 50 years. The story of the 70s bathroom begins, again, on the floor, because once Americans had discovered how pleasant it was to have thick, soft carpet underfoot in the living room, the logical next question was, why stop there? And so the carpet migrated into the bathroom. Wall to wall, right up to the base of the toilet and the tub, the same plush synthetic fiber that was in the living room now covered the bathroom floor, in colors that coordinated with the rest of the room's palette. And then, having made the decision to bring carpet into the bathroom, the next step followed naturally. If the floor could be carpeted, what about the toilet? Not the inside of it, of course, but the exterior surfaces, the tank lid, the seat lid, all of these could be covered in matching fabric. And so they were. You could buy complete sets designed for exactly this purpose, a toilet lid cover, a tank cover, a matching bath mat that extended the coordinated look across the entire room. The effect was thoroughly upholstered, and for a decade that valued texture and warmth and personalization above almost all other design values, it made a certain kind of perfect sense. The fact that bathroom moisture was not particularly kind to carpet and fabric over time was a problem that tended to reveal itself gradually, and by then you were already committed. The color coordination extended even to the toilet paper itself, which during the 70s was manufactured in a range of decorator shades designed to match the bathroom color scheme. You could buy your toilet paper in avocado green or harvest gold or dusty rose, tying the whole room together in a way that satisfied the decade's deep appetite for coordinated design. The trend persisted for several years before researchers eventually established that the dyes used in colored toilet paper contained chemical compounds that were both unnecessarily irritating to skin and somewhat problematic for septic systems, and the colored toilet paper market faded away relatively quickly after that finding made the rounds. But for its moment, it was entirely normal, and plenty of American bathrooms in the first half of the decade were fully committed to the coordinated palette from floor to fixture to paper. Moving back through the house and up toward the walls, we should spend some time with the art and the decoration that filled every available vertical surface in the 70s home, because this decade may have had more things hanging on the walls than any era in American domestic history before or since. The most practical category of wall decor was the decorative weather station, a multi-instrument display that combined a thermometer, a barometer, and a humidity gauge in a single framed wooden unit that hung prominently in the living room or the kitchen. These were not purely functional objects, though they were genuinely functional. Homeowners did glance at them to track changes in barometric pressure that might indicate incoming weather. They were also status objects, signaling a kind of informed, attentive relationship with the natural world. The wood framing was typically stained in the warm walnut tones that the decade favored, and the instruments were faced in brass-colored metal that caught the light pleasantly. Paired with these on the wall, very often, was a matching set of battery-powered clock with faux wood candle sconces on either side, the whole ensemble occupying a section of wall with the gravity and seriousness of a small altar. But the more personal, more expressive category of 70s wall art was the handmade variety, because the decade was also a golden age of DIY craft culture. Macramé in particular became something very close to a national obsession. The technique, which involves knotting cords into decorative patterns, had a long and serious history, but in the 70s it came fully into the American mainstream, and what Americans made with it was mostly owls. The macramé owl, assembled from knotted rope with large button eyes and occasionally real feathers, became the single most iconic decorative object of the decade, appearing in living rooms, kitchens, and hallways across the country in numbers that are difficult to fully comprehend in retrospect. They were made from kits. They were made from scratch. They were made in craft circles and macramé classes and at kitchen tables while the kids did homework. The macramé owl was so thoroughly present in the 70s American home that it has become the shorthand symbol of the entire era's aesthetic. String art ran alongside macramé as a parallel DIY enthusiasm. The technique was simple but satisfying. You drove nails in a pattern into a wooden board, then wound and wove colorful thread or thin wire between the nails, building up a design through the geometry of the winding itself. The results could be surprisingly sophisticated: geometric stars, abstract curves, even pictorial images rendered entirely in stretched thread, and the process was absorbing enough to keep hands and minds occupied through an entire evening of television. String art kits were sold at craft stores and gift shops, and the finished pieces hung proudly next to the macramé owl, the weather station, and the battery-powered clock. And then there were the teen bedrooms, which occupied their own distinct decorative universe entirely. If the adult living room was about warm earth tones and handmade textiles, the American teenager's bedroom of the 1970s was about something else entirely. It was about light. Specifically, ultraviolet light. The Blacklight poster was perhaps the most purely spectacular piece of wall art the decade produced, a printed image on special paper that appeared relatively ordinary under normal lighting but transformed completely under UV illumination into something vivid and electric and almost otherworldly. The colors that responded to blacklight were intense beyond the capacity of daylight printing: hot purples and electric greens and blazing yellows that seemed to glow from within. Fantasy landscapes, psychedelic patterns, rock band imagery, all of it available at Spencer's Gifts in the local mall, rolled up in a cardboard tube and waiting to change the entire atmosphere of a teenager's room the moment the regular lights went off and the blacklight clicked on. And then, in 1976, there appeared on the walls of American teenagers another kind of poster entirely, one that owed nothing to ultraviolet chemistry or psychedelic imagery but became arguably the most famous poster in American history. Farrah Fawcett, photographed in a red swimsuit with a smile that seemed to contain the entire spirit of California sunshine, became an image so widely reproduced and so universally encountered that it defined not just the decade's idea of beauty but something about the entire visual memory of the era. The poster sold in numbers that still astonish, reportedly the best-selling poster of all time, with tens of millions of copies finding their way onto bedroom walls and college dormitory ceilings across the country. It was a photograph, but it functioned like an icon, and it's impossible to discuss the decorative culture of the 70s without acknowledging it. What's remarkable about all of it, looking back, is how thoroughly and how enthusiastically American homeowners committed to these choices. The shag carpet was not a minor decision; it required specialized maintenance equipment. The wallpaper was not a suggestion; it covered the ceiling. The carpet in the bathroom was not a halfway measure; it extended to the toilet itself. The macramé owl was not a passing fancy; it was made by hand, with hours of careful knotting, and hung in the place of honor. These were the decisions of people who had decided, collectively and somewhat defiantly, that their homes were going to express something. That the spaces they lived in were going to be personal, textured, warm, loud if necessary, and completely, unapologetically their own. And maybe that's the most endearing thing about the 70s home. It was excessive, yes. It was occasionally regrettable, yes. The colored toilet paper turned out to be a bad idea, and the shag carpet did swallow an alarming number of earring backs, and not everyone who bought a home organ ever really learned to play it. But the impulse behind all of it was a genuine one: the desire to make a home that felt like somebody actually lived in it, that showed evidence of specific personalities and specific choices and specific enthusiasms. In a world that increasingly offered the same chain stores and the same tract houses and the same mass-produced everything, the avocado green carpet and the macramé owl and the conversation pit were an act of resistance, however improbable that sounds. So the next time you find yourself at an estate sale or a thrift store, and you come across a string art piece still hanging on the wall or a granny square afghan folded on a shelf, take a moment. Somebody made that. Somebody hung it up with real satisfaction and looked at it and thought, yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly us. Because for all its excesses and all its enthusiasms and all its regrettable wallpaper choices, the American home of the 1970s was nothing if not alive. And alive, even when slightly scratchy, is never really something to regret.